Welcome to Buried Whisper. Before we begin, I have just one question for you. Where are you watching from right now? Is it late at night, alone in your room, or maybe in the dark with only your screen glowing? Tell me in the comments what kind of horror chills you the most, because tonight's story might feel a little too real depending on where you are and what time it is. It was early October of last year, somewhere just after 9 in the evening, when I found myself driving along a stretch of old Route 66 between Needles and Barstow. The day had ended warm, but by the time the sun slipped behind the horizon, the air had cooled enough that I cracked the window and let the desert night breeze roll in. The sky was heavy with deep blue clouds, not storm clouds, but the kind that blot out the stars and make the road ahead feel lonelier than it really is. My dashboard clock glowed a dim orange. My headlights cut a narrow path across the empty highway, bouncing off faded road signs and the occasional reflective mile marker. I'd been on the road since the afternoon, leaving Kingman, Arizona, after visiting a friend who worked at a truck stop there. The drive wasn't long, but that stretch of Route 66 can feel endless if you're alone with nothing but static-laced radio stations for company. Every town seemed to be separated by vast pockets of desert and silence. Gas stations were few and far between, and those I passed looked either abandoned or too dark to trust. I told myself I would push through to Barstow before stopping for the night. About 20 minutes after passing Ludlow, I noticed a figure up ahead on the shoulder of the road. At first, I thought it was a trick of my headlights, or maybe one of those roadside memorials people leave behind with a cross and some flowers. But as I got closer, I realized it was a person, a young woman, standing with her arms slightly raised, thumb pointed toward the road. She wore a light jacket over a white dress, something simple and a little outdated, almost like something out of the 70s. Her hair was dark, long, and loose, and even from a distance I could tell she was shivering. I slowed instinctively. Out there in the desert, in the cool night air, leaving someone stranded felt cruel. She didn't look dangerous. She looked like she needed help. My mind raced through all the warnings I'd ever heard about picking up hitchhikers, but my better judgment wavered. I rolled to a stop beside her and leaned over to crank down the passenger side window. "You heading toward Barstow?" I asked. She bent down, her face catching the beam of my headlights just enough for me to see she couldn't have been older than her early 20s. She nodded quickly, her expression polite but tense, like she'd been waiting for hours and was afraid I might drive off. "Yes, thank you," she said. Her voice was soft, almost hoarse. Something in her tone tugged at me. I unlocked the door. She climbed in, folding her hands neatly in her lap. The faint scent of dust and something floral, like lavender, drifted from her. She murmured a quiet, "Thank you," as I pulled back onto the highway. For a while, the only sound in the car was the hum of the engine and the low rush of wind through the cracked window. I tried small talk, kind of late to be out walking. "Car breakdown?" She shook her head. "No car, just trying to get home." "Where's home?" I asked. "Barstow," she said. That was it. No extra details. Her hands stayed clasped tightly in her lap, knuckles pale. I noticed her skin looked strangely pale in general, as if she hadn't been in the sun for weeks. She kept her gaze fixed on the road ahead, barely blinking. I pushed the subject a little. "You visiting someone out here?" "There's not much around." She gave me a thin smile. "I was just passing through." Her answers felt clipped, unfinished, like she was either too tired to talk or didn't trust me enough yet. I let it drop. The miles rolled by. The highway stretched out like a ribbon into the desert, my headlights the only light in sight. Every now and then, the old Route 66 signs appeared, rusted and leaning at odd angles. I checked the rearview mirror, out of habit, and for a second I thought she wasn't there. The seat looked empty in the reflection, but when I glanced sideways, she was sitting exactly where she had been, hands folded neatly. The thought unsettled me, but I brushed it off. Old mirrors, old eyes. Maybe I was just tired. About 10 minutes. From Barstow, I glanced at her again. Her lips were moving, but no sound came out. She was whispering something, eyes fixed straight ahead, voice too low for me to catch. "You all right?" I asked. She stopped immediately as though I'd caught her doing something she shouldn't. She gave me that same thin smile, but this time it seemed forced. "Yes, I'm fine. Thank you again." My mouth was dry. I turned the radio on just for some background noise, but all I could get was static and faint voices bleeding in from distant stations. It didn't help. Another mile or so passed. The town's glow was faint on the horizon, a smear of yellow lights against the darkness. Relief began to settle in. I'd drop her off, maybe at a diner or gas station, and put the weird tension behind me. That was when I heard it. A faint thump from the back seat, like something shifting around. My stomach knotted instantly. I flicked my eyes to the rearview mirror, and again, the back seat looked empty, only shadows. But when I turned my head, just for a second, I swear I saw the outline of another figure sitting behind her, darker than the rest of the car, just there and gone in the blink of an eye. I gripped the steering wheel tighter. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice shaking. She didn't answer. She kept staring straight ahead, lips moving again, whispering words I couldn't catch. Finally, the Barstow exit came into view. I let out a nervous laugh and said, "Almost there." She turned to me then, for the first time since she'd gotten, and her eyes looked too dark in the dashboard light, her expression too blank. "Thank you for the ride," she said softly, when I glanced back to the road and then looked at the passenger seat again. She was gone. The seatbelt still hung. Loose, the faint scent of lavender lingered, but the seat was empty. My hands trembled against the wheel. I slowed the car, pulled over to the shoulder, and sat there with the engine idling, staring at the empty seat beside me. I don't know how long I sat like that before I forced myself to keep driving. I didn't see her again, not in the mirror, not on the road. But when I finally reached Barstow and stopped at a gas station, the clerk gave me a strange look. "You all right?" he asked. I told him I'd picked up a hitchhiker outside Ludlow, but she disappeared before town. His face changed. He leaned on the counter and lowered his voice. "You're not the first. People have been saying that for years. A girl, white dress, dark hair, always wants a ride to Barstow, but no one ever makes it with her in the car." I asked him who she was supposed to be. He just shook his head. "Some say she died out there in the 70s, car crash. Others say she's just waiting for someone who never showed up. Doesn't matter. If you see her, it means she chose you." I left without saying another word. To this day, I don't know if I was hallucinating from exhaustion or if something really sat beside me in that car. But every time I drive Route 66 at night, I roll the windows up tight, keep my eyes fixed on the road ahead, and pray I don't see a girl in a white dress standing on the shoulder waiting for me to stop. It was late October of 2018, the kind of evening when the air in the Sierra Nevadas turns sharp and thin, carrying with it the smell of pine and the faint metallic tang of frost. I was driving my old Toyota Tacoma across Donner Pass, making my way back home from a long weekend in Reno. The sky had already slipped into that bluish twilight where shadows stretch longer than they should, and clouds hung low, smudging out the last of the sun. I had left later than I meant to, around 6, thinking I'd beat most of the traffic. But as I wound my way through the mountain highway, I realized I had underestimated how quickly night takes hold in higher elevations. The stretch of road I was on was mostly empty, save for a few semis lumbering in the opposite direction. It's a lonely route, especially once the sun sets, with guardrails that feel far too flimsy against the sheer drop-offs on either side. The history of Donner Pass weighed in the back of my mind as I drove, a place known for tragedy, loss, and stories that seemed too grim to retell. I never put much stock in ghost stories, but when you're alone up there with nothing but the sound of your tires humming against cold asphalt, even the most skeptical part of your brain starts to entertain ideas you normally wouldn't. It was about 7:30 when the strangeness began. The road had narrowed into a twisting descent, the kind where you ride the brakes carefully so you don't lose control. That's when I noticed headlights appear in my rearview mirror. At first, I was relieved. Another vehicle meant I wasn't so alone anymore. But the lights were far too bright, almost blinding, and they loomed closer much faster than seemed possible on that stretch of highway. I eased over slightly, hoping the driver would pass, but the truck, because by now I could see it was a massive semi with glaring floodlights, didn't overtake me. Instead, it held steady behind me, tailgating so close I could practically feel the heat of its engine pressing into the back of my truck. I muttered under my breath, gripping the wheel tighter. "All right, buddy. You want to go faster? Then go. Around me," I said out loud, though the words disappeared into the hum of the road. I flashed my blinker and tapped my brakes to signal I'd let them pass, but the truck didn't respond. It just stayed there, lights flooding through my rear window, throwing my cabin into stark white brightness. My hands were starting to sweat despite the cold. After what felt like several long minutes, I found a short straightaway and eased onto the shoulder to give the rig room. I slowed to almost a crawl, but as soon as I did, the headlights vanished, not faded into the distance, not dipped behind a curve. They were just gone. I jerked my head back, heart hammering, searching the rear-view mirror. The road stretched empty behind me, nothing but the reflective shine of the guardrails and the dark forest pressing close. No truck, no glow of headlights receding down the pass. Nothing. I sat there for a moment, pulled onto the gravel shoulder, with my hazard lights clicking like a metronome, telling myself I had misjudged. Maybe the truck had veered off onto one of the smaller exits, or maybe the curve of the road had hidden it. But deep down, I knew there hadn't been anywhere for it to go. Trying to shake it off, I pulled back onto the road, though I kept my speed low, nerves buzzing in my veins. A few miles later, the fog rolled in, thin at first and then thicker, curling around the trees and softening the edges of the headlights. My Tacoma's beams cut only a few feet ahead, the mist swallowing everything else. That was when I heard it, the low, steady growl of a diesel engine behind me. I checked my mirror and my stomach dropped. The same blinding headlights flared back into view, much closer this time, bearing down on me as if the truck had never disappeared at all. Gripped the wheel, my pulse hammering in my throat. "No, no, no," I muttered, pressing the gas harder, trying to put distance between me and whatever that was. The Tacoma shuddered on the incline, tires struggling against the steep grade, while the lights behind me grew brighter, swallowing everything in their glare. I rolled down my window, half expecting to hear the roar of an actual engine right on my tail, but there was nothing but silence, no sound that matched the impossible speed of those lights. It didn't make sense. A truck that size should have been deafening. Yet all I heard was my own breathing and the thin rasp of wind. At the next curve, I braked hard, skidding slightly as I tried to control the descent. The lights behind me surged forward, as if the truck would plow straight through me. I braced for impact, for the crunch of metal and glass. But just as quickly as they had appeared, the lights winked out again. I slammed my truck into park on the side of the road, stumbling out into the fog. The cold bit into my skin, the air smelling faintly of ozone and pine sap. My legs felt weak as I stared back into the mist. There was no one there, just the quiet sweep of wind through the trees and the faint hiss of my cooling engine. "Okay," I whispered to myself, trying to steady my shaking hands. "It's just my eyes playing tricks." But then I noticed something in the gravel beside my truck. Tire marks. Deep, fresh grooves carved into the shoulder, running parallel to where I had pulled over. They were wide, far wider than my Tacoma's tires, and the tread matched the kind of pattern you'd see on an 18-wheeler. The track stopped abruptly a few feet behind me, as if the massive vehicle had materialized out of nowhere, and then vanished into thin air. I didn't wait to look any longer. I jumped back into my truck and floored it, praying my old engine would hold out. The fog seemed thicker now, swallowing the road ahead until it felt like I was driving through a dream. My chest ached with the need to breathe, my vision darting constantly between the winding highway and the rearview mirror, waiting for those lights to reappear, and they did. One final time, just as I reached the stretch of Donner Pass known for its sharpest drop, the same curve where countless accidents have claimed lives over the years. The lights came roaring up behind me, brighter than ever, searing through the fog, so close that my entire cab flooded white. I screamed, swerving as the guardrail rushed into view, certain I was about to be shoved over the edge. But when I turned the wheel hard to keep control, the lights vanished for good. No screech of brakes, no crash, just an empty highway stretching, behind me silent and still. By the time I reached the base of the pass, my body felt like it had been wrung out. My hands cramped from clutching the wheel so tight. I pulled into a gas station in Truckee, sat there in the fluorescent glow for nearly an hour, too shaken to keep going. When I finally told someone about it, a trucker fueling up a few pumps down. He gave me a strange look and nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said, voice low and rough. "You're not the first to see it. They say it's a ghost rig. Shows up on Donner Pass to chase drivers right where most people go over. Some say it's the truck that went off the curve back in the 70s. Driver burned alive in the wreck." I wanted to ask more, but he just shook his head, muttered something about bad omens and left. I don't know if I believe in ghosts, and I've told myself for years it was just exhaustion, fog, and my imagination, running wild. But every time I think about that night, I remember the tire marks in the gravel, too deep and too wide for my little truck. And I remember the way the headlights blinded me, pushing me closer to that deadly curve. I haven't taken Donner Pass since, because sometimes I wonder if I had been just a little slower, if I had hesitated a second longer, whether that phantom truck would have finally finished what it started. I was driving home late one evening in September of 2019, heading north on Interstate 5 after visiting a friend in San Diego. It was just after 9 p.m. The sky still carried the fading blue of twilight, heavy with thick clouds that hadn't quite broken into rain yet. The highway stretched endlessly, dark and damp from a drizzle earlier in the day, the streetlights glowing against the wet pavement like faint halos. I kept my windows cracked just enough to feel the cool air rushing in, carrying that sharp smell of wet asphalt mixed with the faint chemical tang of distant diesel. Traffic wasn't heavy. Most of the time I had 2 or 3 cars around me, spaced far enough apart that the road felt strangely empty for such a major highway. My playlist hummed through the car speakers at low volume, just enough to break the silence without pulling me out of the monotony of driving. Everything about that night felt calm, quiet, even comforting in the way long drives sometimes are. Around 9:30, I passed through a stretch of I-5 where the road straightens for miles. To my right was mostly open land, dim silhouettes of fields stretching away into darkness. On the left, a sparse line of trees marked the median. My headlights cut ahead into the night, catching glimpses of the reflective signs in the green, exit markers that felt fewer and farther between. That's when I first noticed the car. It was a dark sedan, maybe black or deep blue. I couldn't tell in the poor light. It slid up beside me in the left lane without warning, matching my speed, almost exactly. For a moment I thought the driver was just passing, but he didn't. He stayed right there, even as I adjusted my speed up and down. Every time I slowed, the car slowed. When I sped up, so did he. I remember gripping the wheel tighter, trying to convince myself it was a coincidence. I turned my head just a quick glance, and that's when I saw him. The driver was staring straight at me, not glancing, not distracted, but staring with an intensity that made my skin crawl. His face was pale, his jaw tight, and his eyes, God, his eyes were wrong. At first I thought maybe the shadows were playing tricks, but no matter how much I looked, his eyes weren't reflecting light the way they should. They were solid black, not dark brown, not hidden by sunglasses. Just 2 pits of black, glossy and empty, fixed entirely on me. I snapped my gaze back to the road, my chest tightening. I tried to laugh it off, whispering to myself, "You're tired. You're just seeing things." But the knot in my stomach told me otherwise. The car stayed beside me, locked to my speed like it was tethered to me. I tapped my brakes lightly, hoping he'd just pass. Instead, the sedan slowed too, hanging just out of my peripheral vision. By now, the road was emptier than ever. No cars. In front of us, none behind that I could see in my mirrors. Just me and him, side by side on a stretch of I-5 that seemed to go on forever. I finally mustered the courage to look again as quick as I could. He was still staring, expressionless, those black eyes unblinking. My skin prickled as if every hair on my body knew something I didn't. I tried dialing my friend to keep myself distracted, but the call failed before it even rang. I checked the signal bars. Nothing. I hadn't realized this stretch had no service, and the sudden isolation hit me harder than I expected. My pulse was hammering in my ears. After maybe 10 minutes of this horrible cat-and-mouse game, the sedan suddenly swerved closer, edging toward my lane. Not fully cutting me off, just close enough that I had to grip the wheel tighter to stay straight. The driver never looked at the road, never broke that locked stare. His head didn't turn, his body didn't shift. He just kept watching me as if driving was secondary to whatever his real focus was. "Okay, screw this," I muttered, and pressed hard on the accelerator. My car roared forward, tires humming against the wet asphalt. For a moment, I thought I'd finally shaken him. The rearview mirror showed nothing but empty highway. My shoulders loosened just slightly, but that relief lasted only seconds. Headlights appeared again, far back at first, then closing the gap with impossible speed. Within half a minute, the black sedan was right behind me, tailgating so close, I couldn't even see its front bumper. The high beams came on, flooding my car with harsh white light reflecting off the wet glass until my eyes stung. I clenched my teeth, swerving slightly, but he stayed glued to me. I don't know how long it lasted. Time became slippery, stretched out. 5 minutes? 10? My hands ached from holding the wheel so tight. My breath fogged the windshield as if the car itself was closing in on me. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the headlights veered sharply to the right. The sedan cut across the lane, barreled onto the shoulder, and in one violent motion, swerved off the highway entirely. No slowing, no brake lights, just straight into the darkness beyond the guardrail where the fields dropped into shadows. I slammed the brakes, my car screeching until it came to a shaky stop on the side of the road. My whole body trembled. I twisted in my seat, peering into the distance, but there was nothing. No headlights, no taillights, no crash sounds, no twisted metal. Just the endless dark field and the faint hiss of wind. For a long time I sat there, engine idling, forcing myself to breathe. Eventually, another car passed, the driver honking angrily at me for blocking the shoulder. That broke me out of my trance. I pulled back onto the highway, drove the rest of the way home with the radio turned low, and never once looked into the side mirrors. The next morning I checked the news, expecting to hear about a wreck or maybe even a missing driver reported along that stretch. Nothing, no crashes, no patrols, no disturbances at all. It was as if the black sedan had never existed. I've driven I-5 many times since then, and every time when the sun dips low and the clouds hang heavy, I find myself watching the left lane, waiting. Some nights, I swear I catch a glimpse of headlights pulling alongside me only to vanish before I can look. I don't tell people this story anymore because they laugh, say I must have been tired, hallucinating, half asleep at the wheel. Maybe they're right, but I know what I saw. I know those eyes. And the worst part isn't that he disappeared. The worst part is that when I close my own eyes at night, sometimes I see his face again, pale and still, staring at me from the dark. I used to drive Highway 101 every week, usually on Friday evenings, making the 2-hour trip north to visit my parents in a quiet town just past San Luis Obispo. I knew the road well enough that I could almost drive it blindfolded. If you've ever taken it around dusk, you know how strange the atmosphere can get. The way the Pacific fog drifts in and the sky dims in this bluish haze. Sometimes it feels like you're the only car out there, caught between endless stretches of coastline and dark rows of eucalyptus trees. One Friday last fall, I left my apartment later than usual. It was about 6:45 p.m. when I merged onto the highway just outside Santa Barbara. The air had that heavy coastal chill, the kind that makes you roll the window up even though you were fine with it down 10 minutes earlier. The clouds had thickened into a flat gray sheet overhead, and the sun had slipped behind them, leaving everything in that weird in-between light where the world doesn't feel quite day or night. Traffic was surprisingly thin for a Friday, and the further north I went, the emptier it got. The road stretched out ahead of me in long, curving lanes bordered by cliffs on one side and open land on the other. My headlights flicked on automatically, cutting pale beams into the deepening dusk. I wasn't in any rush. I kept to about 65, sipping at the gas station coffee I'd grabbed earlier. The radio was low, playing some old rock station. Everything felt normal, almost comfortingly routine. That's why what happened still unsettles me. Nothing about it felt cinematic or exaggerated. It felt like it could happen to anyone. Around 7:30, maybe closer to 8, I saw flashing red and blue lights in my rear-view mirror. At first, I thought it might be an ambulance or another driver pulled over, but the lights grew sharper and steadier and I realized it was a patrol car behind me. I checked my speed. 65 in a 60 zone. Nothing reckless. My seatbelt was on, headlights working, plates up to date. Still, the cruiser edged closer, the lights strobing against my mirror until I reluctantly slowed and pulled onto the narrow shoulder. My car rumbled as I rolled over the uneven pavement and stopped just past one of those reflective green mile markers. I sat there, engine idling, fingers drumming the wheel, waiting. The patrol car pulled in behind me, headlights still on, but strangely the siren never sounded. Just the rotating lights. I remember glancing in the mirror, trying to get a clearer look. It was definitely a black and white vehicle. The kind CHP usually drives, but there was something odd about it. I couldn't see the license plate. It looked blank, or maybe the glare made it unreadable. I rolled the window down halfway and reached for my wallet. A figure got out of the cruiser. The door opened slowly, almost too slowly, and the shape of a man emerged, silhouetted by the headlights. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing what looked like the standard tan uniform, but I couldn't make out a face, just the brim of a hat. He walked with a kind of deliberate, heavy stride, each step measured, no hurry. The weirdest part? I couldn't hear anything. No crunch of gravel under his boots, no click of a holster, no sound of a radio static. Just the low hum of my own car. He stopped at my driver's side door, leaning down slightly. I kept my eyes on the mirror because something in me didn't want to look directly at him. Still, from the corner of my vision, I saw a pale hand rest on the edge of the window. It didn't look gloved. His skin was oddly smooth, like wax, catching the light in an unnatural way. "Evening," I said, trying to sound casual. My throat felt dry. Was I speeding? No answer. The figure just stood there, not breathing heavily, not shifting weight, not writing anything down. Just standing. The red and blue lights pulsed across his uniform, but his face remained shadowed, no features coming into focus. I tried again, forcing a laugh. "Everything okay, officer?" Nothing. Then, after what felt like a full minute of silence, he straightened up and turned away, walking back toward the patrol car. I watched his reflection in the side mirror, waiting for some signal, some gesture to follow, maybe a wave to step out. But he never looked back. He moved slowly, unhurried, until he reached the cruiser and disappeared behind the glare of its headlights. I sat frozen for a moment, then turned my head to check over my shoulder. That's when my stomach dropped. The patrol car was gone. Not parked further back, not pulling away down the road. Just gone. The highway stretched empty behind me, dark and quiet. The only light coming from my own taillights reflecting on the mile marker. No sound, no trace of another vehicle. I blinked hard, rubbed at my eyes, craned my neck to double-check. Nothing. My first thought was that maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe it was stress, the long week catching up to me. But my window was still, rolled down halfway, and I could feel the damp night air on my arm. And I swear, the faint scent of cologne lingered there. Something sharp and old-fashioned, like aftershave. I put the car back in gear and merged back onto the road. My hands tight on the wheel. I didn't turn the radio back on. I just listened to the sound of the tires and the faint rattle of my coffee cup in the holder. The rest of the drive was uneventful, but I couldn't shake the sense of being watched. Every so often, I'd glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting the red and blue lights to reappear. They never did. Still, my stomach stayed clenched until I pulled into my parents' driveway around 9:15. Their house lights spilled across the lawn, warm and safe. And for a moment, I considered not telling them anything. Just going inside, eating dinner, pretending the drive had been normal. But later that night, I searched online. I typed in Highway 101 Ghost Cop and Phantom Patrol Car. The results startled me. I found old forum posts, mostly ignored, with people describing almost the exact same thing. A cruiser pulling them over, an officer who didn't speak, a vehicle that vanished when they looked away. Some claimed the silent cop had been seen for decades, always around dusk, always on long stretches of the highway. A few said he only appeared to people driving alone. I don't know what I encountered. I can't prove it happened. But every time I drive Highway 101 now, especially if it's close to dark, I find myself slowing when the road curves, checking my mirror compulsively, waiting for those lights to flicker back into view. I haven't seen them again. Not yet, but I can't shake the memory of that pale hand on my window, the weight of someone watching me without ever saying a word. And sometimes, when the road is empty enough and the fog settles low, I swear I hear another engine trailing just behind, me steady and patient, keeping pace until the lights fade and the highway stretches on, silent as the grave. It was late October of last year, around 10:45 at night, when I started the drive back home on Ortega Highway. If you've never driven it, it's a twisting stretch of road in Southern California that cuts through the Cleveland National Forest, connecting Lake Elsinore to San Juan Capistrano. At night, especially in the colder months, it feels like you're driving through an endless tunnel of black hills and thick fog. The headlights barely touch the guardrails before the darkness swallows them again. I had driven it dozens of times before, but that night, I remember thinking the road looked different, lonelier somehow. The weather report had mentioned light fog in the area, but what I saw creeping over the ridges felt more like heavy smoke. It rolled in patches, sometimes so thin I could see the outlines of the rocky hillsides, other times so thick the beams of my high beams dissolved into a glowing white wall. The dashboard clock read 10:51 when I noticed how quiet everything seemed. Usually that road hums with the occasional motorcycle or the growl of lifted trucks tearing around corners. That night it was just me, my car, and the hiss of the tires against the asphalt. I was maybe 20 minutes into the drive when I first thought I heard it. A faint sound, thin and sharp, carried on the wind. At first I chalked it up to the groan of the engine or maybe a coyote somewhere in the brush. But as I rolled down the next incline, cutting through a dense blanket of fog, I realized it wasn't an animal. It sounded like crying, a child crying. I sat up straighter, hands tightening on the steering wheel. The noise was distant, but it threaded through the silence in a way that made my skin prickle. It wasn't constant, more like short bursts of sobbing followed by silence. I turned down the radio, even killed the AC, trying to convince myself I wasn't hearing things. But the moment the cabin of the car went still, the sound reached me again. High, shaky, unmistakably human. I slowed, the speedometer dipping, under 30. Ortega doesn't have streetlights, just the occasional reflective marker nailed into the guardrails. My headlights cut through the fog, illuminating stretches of empty road that twisted out of sight. The crying came again, this time louder, closer, and to my right. I craned my neck toward the passenger window, scanning the brush that lined the road. For a moment I thought I saw movement, a pale shape shifting between the manzanita and tall grass, but when I blinked it was gone. I told myself it wasn't possible. No kid would be out there at this hour, not in that cold, not in that fog. Still, my stomach churned with guilt. What if it was? What if a car had broken down and some poor family's kid had wandered into the brush? Against every instinct telling me to keep driving, I slowed to a stop on the shoulder. The second I put the car in park, the sound cut off. Just like that. No echo, no fading, just silence. I sat there, my car idling, listening so hard my ears rang. I could see maybe 5 feet into the fog on either side, the faint outline of a guardrail in front and the inky blackness of the forest beyond. Nothing moved. Then, faintly, the crying started again. Only this time, it came from behind me. I whipped, around in my seat, staring out the rear window. My taillights glowed red, painting the fog into a thick, suffocating wall. I couldn't see the road behind me at all. The sobbing rose and fell, clearer now, the kind of raw, helpless crying that belongs to a child no older than 6 or 7. My throat went dry. I fumbled for my phone, debating calling the police, but what was I supposed to say? That I'd pulled over on Ortega Highway because I heard crying in the fog? They'd dismiss it as nerves or wind carrying sounds from somewhere else. Still, something in me, call it decency, call it stupidity, forced me to get out. The cold hit first. The damp air clung to my clothes and filled my lungs with the smell of wet earth and sagebrush. I left the headlights on, the car running, doors unlocked just in case. I stepped slowly toward the sound, boots crunching against gravel. The crying stopped again. "Hello?" My voice cracked in the fog. "Is someone out there?" Silence. Then a sharp, sucking inhale, like the way kids hiccup when they've been crying too long. It was close now, maybe 20 feet into the brush. "I'm here to help," I called, though my hands trembled. "Where are you?" No answer. I moved closer, the beam from my phone flashlight cutting through the fog in a narrow cone. The light caught branches, wet leaves, rocks slick with dew. I kept waiting to see the small shape of a child huddled there. Instead, I found nothing, just trees and shadows. The crying started again, this time to my left. I spun, flashlight beam, shaking, but the fog seemed to thicken with the sound. It wasn't far, no more than 10 feet, but no matter where I aimed the light, there was nothing. Just the fog pulsing with that awful noise. That's when the smell hit me, faint at first, then stronger. The sharp metallic tang of rust and something sweeter underneath, like rotting fruit. It cut through the crisp night air, sour and wrong. My stomach turned. I took a step back, then another. The crying changed. It wasn't the weak sobbing of a child anymore. It was louder, ragged, like someone forcing the sound out of their throat, a mimicry of a child. Every instinct screamed at me to run, and I did. I bolted back toward the car, the beam from my phone swinging wildly. For a moment, I swear I caught sight of something just outside the reach of the headlights, a shape low, to the ground, pale, crouched. But by the time I blinked, it was gone. I slammed the driver's door shut and locked it. My chest heaved as I fumbled the car into gear. As I pulled back onto the road, the crying started again, louder than ever, as if it was right outside the window. I pressed the gas, pushing the car up to 40, 50, 60. The sound didn't fade. It followed, trailing alongside the car, weaving through the fog like it was inside the night itself. Then, just as suddenly, it stopped. The road straightened. Ahead of me, the fog thinning, the lights of Lake Elsinore glowing faintly in the distance. My ears rang in the silence. I drove the rest of the way home without stopping, hands white-knuckled on the wheel. I didn't tell anyone about it at first. But 2 weeks later, a coworker mentioned hearing about Ortega Highway's crying child. Apparently, for years, drivers have reported hearing a little boy sobbing in the fog late at night. Some say he's the ghost of a kid who died in a car accident out there decades ago. Others claim it's not a child at all, but something else. Something that waits for people soft enough, stupid enough to pull over. I've taken Ortega a handful of times since then, always during the day. At night, I go the long way around, even if it adds an hour to my drive, because sometimes when I'm alone in my car with the radio turned down, I still think I hear it. That thin, high-pitched sobbing, just beyond the edge of the headlights, waiting for me to stop again. It was a little past 9 on a Sunday night in late October, the kind of evening where the air feels heavy, like it's carrying the weight of an approaching storm. I had been driving back home from Reading along Highway 299, a route I'd taken more times than I could count. The road wound its way through forested hills and narrow stretches where the asphalt seemed to cling to the cliffs. Drivers who knew the area gave one particular section a nickname, Dead Man's Curve. It was a tight, sloping bend with no shoulder, no guardrails, and a steep drop on the other side. Most locals slowed to a crawl there, especially after dark. The sky was layered with thick gray clouds hiding the moon completely. My headlights carved a tunnel of pale light through the darkness, reflecting off the damp sheen of the asphalt. I had the heater running low, filling the car with that faint, dry, metallic smell older cars give off when the vents kick on. The radio played softly, some late-night talk station fading in and out with static as the mountains disrupted the signal. I wasn't in any hurry. The small town where I lived was still another 40 minutes away, and traffic was almost non-existent that night. I passed a few trucks heading in the opposite direction, their headlights flooding my windshield before vanishing into the rearview mirror. Beyond that, there was only the quiet stretch of road ahead, lined with trees that pressed close on both sides like silent sentries. As I approached Dead Man's Curve, I eased off the gas, instinctively lowering my speed. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. Every local had heard stories about accidents there, cars that went over the edge, motorcyclists who never made it through. Some swore the bend was cursed, that there were more wrecks on that stretch than anywhere else on the highway. I didn't believe in curses, but I wasn't reckless either. That's when I saw her. At first it registered as a flicker of pale movement ahead, just at the edge of my headlights. I leaned forward instinctively, eyes straining to make sense of what I was seeing. A woman. She stepped directly into the road not 20 yards ahead. Her skin looked unnaturally pale, her hair dark and hanging damply around her face. She wore a long white dress, loose and old-fashioned, the hem trailing just above her bare feet. My heart lurched. I slammed the brakes and jerked the wheel, the tires screeching against the damp pavement as the car swerved dangerously close to the cliff's edge. The seatbelt cut hard against my chest, the world tilting for a sickening second before the car straightened. When I looked up again, the road was empty. My pulse hammered in my ears. I sat there for a moment, breathing hard, gripping the wheel like it might anchor me. I replayed it in my mind. She had been right there, stepping out into the lane, eyes fixed on me. I could have hit her. I should have hit her. But there was nothing. No body, no sound, just the distant hiss of my engine cooling and the muted rush of the river far below. I pulled over at the first patch of gravel I could find, threw the car in park, and climbed out. The night air was cold and damp, carrying the smell of wet pine and earth. My hands shook as I flicked on my flashlight and scanned the curve. The beam caught slick black asphalt, the gleam of wet leaves, the empty guardrail-less edge. No sign of anyone. I called out, my voice trembling. "Hello? Are you okay? Do you need help?" Only silence answered, thick and heavy, the kind that made every creak of the forest sound amplified. I stood there for what felt like minutes, the flashlight beam jittering across the trees, the road, the drop. No footprints, no torn fabric, nothing at all. Reluctantly, I got back in the car and drove on, forcing myself to keep moving. My nerves didn't settle, though. Every curve of the road felt sharper, every shadow deeper. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see her sitting in the back seat, pale, face staring at me from the dark. When I finally pulled into my driveway, the house was dark except for the porch light I'd left on. The familiar sight should have calmed me, but instead the silence of the neighborhood seemed oppressive. I sat in the car for a few minutes, engine off, listening to the tick of cooling metal. Inside, I tried to convince myself it had been a trick of the light, a hallucination caused by fatigue and the strange glow of headlights on mist. Maybe I had mistaken a patch of fog or a pale tree trunk. That explanation might have worked, if it weren't for what happened next. Later that night, unable to sleep, I sat at the kitchen table scrolling aimlessly through my phone. I ended up on a local community Facebook group where someone had posted an old news clipping from years ago. The headline made my stomach drop. Fatal crash on Highway 299 near Dead Man's Curve. The article described a young woman, 24, who had been killed after her car veered off the bend late one October night. Her photo accompanied the article. Dark hair, pale face, a white dress in her engagement picture. I shut off my phone and sat in the silence of my kitchen, every nerve buzzing. I didn't tell anyone about what I saw. Not my family, not my friends. They would have laughed it off, called it a ghost story. But I know what I saw on that road. She was there, stepping out in front of me as real as any living person, and now, every time I drive that stretch of 299, I slow down long before Dead Man's Curve. My hands sweat on the steering wheel. My eyes search the darkness. Because I know she's out there waiting for someone else to come around the bend, and one night she won't just make them swerve. I want to tell you something that happened to me a few years ago on the Grapevine. For anyone not familiar, that's the stretch of Interstate 5 that cuts through the Tehachapi Mountains in California, connecting the Central Valley to Los Angeles. It's a steep, winding route that's notorious for accidents, sudden fog, and long nighttime drives that can make you feel like you're the only person left in the world. I was living in Bakersfield at the time, and it was late October. Chilly, dry air, the kind that carries the smell of dust and diesel from the trucks. It was a Sunday evening, around 7:30. The sun had already dropped behind the ridges, leaving a heavy blue twilight clinging to the slopes. The weather forecast had warned of light rain, but all I saw were thin, fast-moving clouds blotting out the stars. I had spent the weekend with a friend in Los Angeles and was heading north again. My car was a beat-up Honda Accord, the kind that hummed when it hit higher speeds, and I kept the radio turned low just to fill the silence. That stretch of the Grapevine is strange at night. You can be surrounded by semi-trucks, their red taillights forming a chain up the grade, and then, suddenly it feels like they've all vanished. The highway gets so dark between the floodlit rest stops that your headlights barely carve out a cone of clarity ahead of you. I was cruising in the right lane at about 60, sipping cold coffee from a gas station cup, when I noticed the smell. It was faint at first, like someone had lit a fireplace far away. Wood smoke, sharp and dry, mixed with something else, like burned plastic or rubber. I rolled down the window slightly, thinking maybe a truck ahead of me was having engine trouble, but the air outside was even worse. It clung to the inside of my nose, acrid and sour, and I instinctively rolled the glass back up. About a mile further, I saw him. At first, I thought it was just another hitchhiker. There are plenty of them on that route, and it's not unusual to see someone with their thumb out near an exit. But this man wasn't near an exit, and he wasn't standing. He was stumbling along the shoulder, moving in jerky, uneven steps, like his legs didn't fully obey him. My high beams caught the shine of something dark and wet down his left arm. I slowed automatically, trying to make sense of it. He looked burned. Not just singed clothes, but his whole body seemed charred. His shirt was hanging in melted tatters, blackened at the edges. His face, God, I can still see it, looked like someone had pressed it against a grill. Red flesh glistened under patches of blistered black. He turned his head toward my car as I approached, and for a split second our eyes locked. His were wide open, glistening white in the glare of my headlights. He lifted one arm as if to wave, but it was bent at a strange angle, as if the bones underneath had broken and never reset. I gripped the wheel tighter, debating whether to pull over or keep going. Everything in me screamed not to stop. There was no good reason for a man in that condition to be walking alone up here, miles from any real shelter. Then as I passed, he crumpled. I saw his knees give out in the corner of my mirror. He fell, hard onto the asphalt, his arms folding under him in a way that made me gasp. My conscience kicked in. I couldn't just drive away. My hands were shaking as I pulled onto the narrow shoulder about 50 yards ahead and hit the hazard lights. The smell hit me again, stronger this time, even with the windows shut, smoke and scorched hair. I dug my phone from the cup holder, intending to call 911, but the screen said, "No service." The Grapevine does that sometimes, cutting you off at the worst moments. I left the car running, headlights throwing their glow back down the road, and stepped out. The cold hit me instantly, mixing with the sickly warmth of the smell. Gravel crunched under my sneakers as I walked toward the spot where he had collapsed. But he wasn't there. The shoulder was empty, just cracked pavement, a thin guardrail, and the looming silhouette of pines against the sky. My hazard lights ticked in the distance, steady and mechanical. I turned in a slow circle, thinking maybe he had crawled into the brush or stumbled farther along. But the road stretched on bare and silent. The only sound was the faint whistle of wind between the guardrails. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. "Hello?" I called, my voice breaking. "Sir? Are you hurt?" Nothing. No reply, no rustling in the bushes. Nothing, but my own breath clouding the cold air. I stood there for maybe a full minute, staring at the empty asphalt before retreating to my car. I locked the doors the second I was inside and fumbled with my phone again. Still no service. I sat gripping the wheel, too scared to move but even more terrified of staying still. Eventually, I pulled back onto the highway. I kept glancing in, the mirror, half expecting to see him chasing me down the lane, but all I saw was the red flicker of my own taillights. About 20 minutes later, I pulled into a truck stop near Lebec. The smell was gone, and my bars of service came back. I called the local CHP office and explained what I'd seen. The dispatcher was polite but calm, like she'd heard similar calls before. She said they'd send a patrol car to check, but she didn't sound surprised. When I asked if anyone else had reported something like it, she hesitated. Then she said, "You're not the first person to see him." I pressed her, but she wouldn't say more, just repeated that an officer would investigate. I sat there for almost half an hour, waiting for my nerves to settle before continuing home. The image of that burned man has never left me. The way his eyes locked on mine, the way he collapsed so unnaturally, and the way he vanished without a trace. Sometimes I wonder if he was a survivor from one of the many fires that have torn through those mountains over the years. Maybe he never made it out. Maybe what I saw was the last echo of someone who died on that lonely highway still trying to find help. But then I remember the smell. The smoke, thick and suffocating, filling my car as if the fire was still burning. That wasn't memory. That wasn't imagination. And sometimes when I drive the Grapevine at night, I swear I catch a glimpse of someone limping along the shoulder, just beyond the reach of my headlights. I don't stop anymore. I keep driving, windows rolled tight, and I try not to breathe too deep because I know if I stop I might find nothing, or worse, I might find him waiting. I've driven Highway 1 more times than I can count. My girlfriend and I used to take weekend trips down the coast, just for the sake of watching the cliffs fade into fog and feeling like we were hanging off the edge of the world. Big Sur has that effect on you. The stretch between Carmel and San Simeon feels detached from California itself, like you're threading through some dreamscape stitched from ocean spray and pine forests. The last time I went was October of last year. I remember the details because I've obsessed over them since, trying to make sense of what happened. It was a Saturday around 6 in the evening. The weather was typical for the coast. Low overcast skies with that deep twilight blue settling, in cool air seeping through the cracks of the window and the faint smell of salt carried inland. The traffic was light, almost eerily so. That stretch of Highway 1 is narrow, hugging the cliffs with nothing but a guardrail between you and the ocean far below. You don't want to take your eyes off the road for long. I was driving south, alone, this time, in my old Honda Civic. My girlfriend had a work thing she couldn't skip, so I figured I'd make a solo trip, clear my head. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, leaving that afterglow that makes everything look washed in silver. I remember passing Bixby Creek Bridge, slowing down because I always do there, just to take it in. The bridge was empty, just my headlights, sweeping across its concrete arch as I crossed. Not long after, I noticed headlights in my rear view. A car came around the bend behind me, sudden and sharp, like it had been waiting until the last possible second to appear. It was an older model, maybe a 60s or 70s classic, black, low-slung, with chrome that caught what little light there was. I thought it might have been a Chevy Impala or maybe a Dodge Charger, but I couldn't tell in the dark. At first, I didn't think much of it. People drive all sorts of cars down there. But then I realized how close it was. The headlights weren't just behind me. They were practically filling my mirrors, so bright I had to squint. I tapped the brakes lightly, not enough to slow down much, but just to send the message that it was too close. The car didn't back off. I told myself it was probably some impatient local, someone who knew the road better than I did. But the way it moved didn't feel right. Every time the road curved, I could see its outline in the mirror, hugging every turn perfectly, no sway, no hesitation. It was like it was glued to me. After a few miles of this, I pulled toward the shoulder. There aren't many places to do that safely, but I found a small turnout overlooking the ocean. I slowed, put on my blinker, and waited for the black car to roar past. Except it didn't. The second I eased onto the gravel shoulder, the headlights vanished. Not faded in the distance, not slowed down. They were simply gone. I craned my neck, checking the bend behind me. Nothing. Just the dark ribbon of highway curling along the cliff, empty and silent. I remember my stomach dropping like I'd just missed a step on a staircase. I sat there for a good minute, engine idling, listening. The ocean was below, its roar muffled by the wind. The air smelled faintly of pine resin. Everything was normal, except that I'd just watched a car disappear. Eventually, I told myself it must have turned off on one of those hidden dirt access roads locals sometimes use. Maybe I'd just missed it. I pulled back onto the highway trying to shake it off, but the longer I drove, the less convinced I became. There hadn't been any time for a turnoff. No sound of gravel under tires. No taillights in the distance. Just me and the cliffs again. About 10 minutes later, as I rounded another bend, the headlights were back. Same spot in my mirror, same blinding closeness. My chest tightened. It was as if the car had been waiting, biding its time before showing itself again. I sped up, pushing the Civic harder than I usually dared on those curves. My tires squealed once when I took a turn too tight. Still, the black car stayed glued behind me, never gaining, never falling back. Just there. I tried something stupid then. I flicked off my headlights for half a second, just to see if the other driver would react. When I flicked them back on, the rear view was empty. No headlights, no car. My pulse was hammering so loud I could barely hear the wind anymore. I drove the rest of that stretch like a madman, desperate to reach the next lodge or gas station. My hands ached from gripping the wheel so hard. I finally pulled into a small turnout where a few other cars were parked, probably people watching, the waves below. I killed the engine, sat there and stared at the mirrors. Nothing came. No black car. That night, I stayed at a motel in San Simeon, barely slept, and drove home the next morning through the inland route, nowhere near the cliffs. I didn't want to risk seeing it again. Later, when I mentioned it to a coworker who grew up near Monterey, she gave me this long, unreadable look before saying, "Yeah, people talk about that. The disappearing car. It's supposed to be an old driver who went off the cliffs back in the 70s. Tailgates tourists until they pull over, then, well, you saw what happens." She said it so casually, like it was just another coastal legend. But the way her voice tightened at the end told me she believed it. I haven't been back to Big Sur since. Sometimes at night, when I'm driving home on empty roads, I catch myself checking the mirror too often. Every set of headlights feels like it's waiting to vanish, and sometimes I swear I see the glint of chrome just before the darkness swallows it. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't pulled over that first time. I don't know what it wants or why it chooses some drivers and not others. What I do know is this. If you ever find yourself alone on Highway 1 at dusk, and you see a classic black car filling your mirrors, don't wait for it to pass, because it never will. I've debated for a long time whether I should even share this because I know how it's going to sound. A shadow on the road, a trick of the desert night, sleep deprivation. I've heard every explanation already because I've tried to explain it to myself more times than I can count. But the truth is, I still can't drive Route 395 at night without white-knuckling the steering wheel, convinced that if I look too long out the window, I'll see them again. It was late August of 2018, one of those dry California nights where the air feels like an oven, even after the sun goes down. I had left Reno a little later than I wanted, close to 9 p.m., with the plan to head south toward Victorville, where my sister lived. That meant hours of desert highway, Route 395 cutting straight through a landscape that's both beautiful and terrifying in its emptiness. The stretch of highway I'm talking about is the part where there's nothing but open desert on either side. No streetlights, no gas stations for miles, just the faded center line glowing against the high beams of your car. I had a cooler with water in the passenger seat, my phone plugged into the charger, and a playlist running low in the background. I wasn't in a rush. It felt calm, like I had the entire road to myself. I remember checking the dashboard clock as I passed Bishop. It read 10:42 p.m. The sky outside was layered with dark blue clouds, the kind that looked like torn paper with thin gaps where the stars peek through. The air conditioning hummed, carrying the faint plastic smell of the vents. I had that quiet, content feeling you sometimes get on a long drive. That would change quickly. The first odd thing happened just past a small sign marking 395 South. I noticed something moving in the edge of my headlights, way out in the dirt shoulder. At first I thought it was a coyote or maybe a stray dog. The desert has plenty of them. But as I passed, it didn't dart away or freeze like an animal usually does. It moved parallel to the car, long and fast, too fast for a coyote. I told myself it must have been my imagination, that maybe I caught the flicker of a shadow or a tree stump. Except the desert around that stretch is flat and bare, no trees, no bushes taller than my knees. I shook it off and turned up the music a little. Another 20 minutes went by. I was hitting about 70 miles per hour, steady speed, nothing unusual. Then I caught it again. Movement. This time not just a flicker. It was clearer. There was something keeping pace with the car, sprinting alongside me on the passenger side just beyond the edge of the road. My first thought was that it had to be a trick of the lights, maybe the reflection of my own headlights bouncing weirdly off the uneven ground. I tried not to look directly at it just in case my eyes were playing games, but curiosity won. I glanced to the right. For a split second I saw a figure, thin, blacker than the night around it, moving on all fours at first, and then upright, arms pumping unnaturally fast. I swear its head turned toward me. But then it was gone, swallowed back into the dark. I muttered, "What the hell was that?" Out loud, like saying it would make it less real. My hands tightened on the wheel. I drove another mile, scanning the road, convincing myself it had been nothing more than highway hypnosis. I'd been driving for hours already, and the monotony can do strange things to your brain. That's what I wanted to believe. But it wasn't over. At 11:30 p.m., somewhere near Lone Pine, I saw them again. Not one this time. Two. Both running in perfect unison with my car, one on each side. Their forms weren't clear, just shadows, like silhouettes carved out of the desert itself. They didn't fall behind, even when I pushed the car up to 75. Their movements weren't human. They didn't stumble or tire. They just ran, long strides, arms and legs cutting through the dark in a rhythm that matched my own heartbeat. I tried to ignore them. I cranked the volume on my phone to drown out the sound of my own breathing, but then one of them veered closer, edging toward the asphalt. My high beams caught just enough to show its legs weren't right. Too long, too thin, the joints bent wrong. "Jesus Christ," I whispered, and that's when I made the mistake of slowing down. I thought maybe if I eased off the gas, they'd disappear. Instead, the one on the right side darted closer, just for a moment, and I swear to God I heard something hit the side of my car, not like a rock or gravel, but the flat, heavy slap of a hand. I floored it after that. The car groaned as I pushed it to 85, then 90. My pulse was louder than the music now. I risked another glance to the right. Nothing. To the left. Nothing. They were gone. For a while, I let myself believe I'd outrun them. I drove another 45 minutes, maybe more. The desert blurred past. The sky stretched wider and darker, and the road seemed endless. My grip on the wheel loosened. My breathing slowed. I told myself it had been some strange trick of exhaustion and light. And then, just as I started to feel calm again, I saw headlights in the distance coming toward me from the opposite lane. That was a relief. A reminder that I wasn't alone on the highway. As the other car approached, I noticed its driver flicked their high beams on, and then off again quickly, the universal signal for danger or a warning. I squinted, confused. As the car passed, I caught a glimpse of the driver's face. He was pale, wide-eyed, and he lifted one hand from the wheel, pointing frantically toward my passenger side window. Just a quick motion, but unmistakable. I turned my head. Running right alongside me, so close its outline filled the window, was one of them. The shadow. Its head was level with mine, but its body moved with impossible speed, feet barely touching the dirt shoulder. Its face, or what should have been a face, was empty. A void. No features, just black. I screamed and swerved the car hard left, nearly into the center line. By the time I straightened out, it was gone again. I didn't see it fall back. It just vanished. The rest of the drive to Victorville is a blur. I don't remember the last 2 hours of road. All I know is that when I pulled into my sister's driveway at 2 a.m., the side of my car had 3 long streaks of grime smeared across. The passenger door, like handprints, only larger. I've never told her what really happened. I said I probably hit some bushes along the shoulder, even though there aren't any that tall on that stretch of 395. I had the car washed the next morning, but I kept staring at where the marks had been, running my hand over the paint, expecting to feel something still clinging there. I haven't driven that route alone since, and every time I hear about an accident on 395, especially the ones where drivers swerve for no reason and roll into the desert, I wonder if they saw them too. The shadows that can keep up with you at 70 miles per hour. And I wonder what happens when they finally decide to step off the shoulder and into the road. It was the summer of 2018, and I was driving eastbound on Highway 50 through the Sierra Nevada stretch, what people around here call the loneliest road in America. I had left Sacramento late in the afternoon, hoping to make it across Nevada before dawn. The weather that evening was oddly heavy, the air thick with the smell of damp earth, though it hadn't rained in days. The sky was clouded. Layers of deep blue pressed against the horizon, and the last of the sunlight gave everything that strange twilight glow, soft and gold, but dying quickly. The road was quiet. The hum of my tires was steady and rhythmic, almost hypnotic. I had a thermos of coffee and a pack of sunflower seeds to keep me awake. My phone had no signal once I passed Fallon, so the radio was my only company, static-filled oldies stations that cut in and out. The world outside felt emptied, stripped down to dark silhouettes of sagebrush and the occasional bend of asphalt disappearing into miles of flat desert. About 45 minutes past Austin, I saw him. At first, I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks, because it's not often you see anyone walking on this stretch of 50. A man stood on the shoulder facing the road, one arm raised stiffly like he was flagging me down. He looked young, maybe mid-20s, dressed oddly formal for someone, stranded out here, black slacks, a white button-up shirt, sleeves rolled neatly to his elbows. His hair was dark and cut short, and he carried no backpack, no jacket, no visible sign of luggage. I slowed instinctively. My dad used to tell me stories about people breaking down out here, sometimes walking miles before seeing another car. Leaving someone on the side of the highway felt cruel. I pulled over, gravel crunching under my tires. The man stepped closer, his face illuminated in my headlights. He smiled, polite and restrained, but there was something unusual in his expression, like he was grateful but also expectant. "You headed east?" he asked. His voice was calm, steady, maybe too calm for someone stranded in the desert at night. "Yeah," I said. "You need a ride?" "I would appreciate it." He opened the passenger door and slid in without hesitation, folding his hands neatly in his lap. The air changed when he entered, just slightly cooler, though the vents in my car were already off. He smelled faintly of rain on dry dirt, that petrichor scent you get before a storm. I tried to keep things casual as I pulled back onto the highway. "Where you headed?" "Not far," he said, looking out the window at the endless dark. "I'll let you know when we're close." That answer wasn't reassuring, but I told myself maybe he was embarrassed, or maybe his story was complicated. We drove in silence for several miles, my high beams cutting through the empty road. Then he spoke again. "You're tired. You should be careful." I glanced at him. His face was pale in the dim light, his features sharp but not unfriendly. "Yeah," I admitted. "Been driving a while." "You've been driving since Sacramento," he said. I tightened my grip on the wheel. I hadn't told him that. "Excuse me?" He turned his head and looked at me directly for the first time. His eyes were dark, reflective, and they seemed to hold a weight far heavier than someone his age should carry. His smile deepened, almost like he enjoyed the confusion on my face. "You left Sacramento at 4:37 p.m., he continued softly, like he was reciting facts from a notebook. "Stopped at a gas station outside Fallon, filled your tank, bought coffee and seeds. You paid with your card, the one ending in 09. My chest tightened. I hadn't seen another car for miles. Nobody had been at that station when I stopped. "How do you know that?" I asked, my voice harsher than I intended. He leaned closer, his breath cool against my ear despite the warmth of the car. And then he whispered my full name. First, middle, last. Every syllable, pronounced perfectly. I slammed on the brakes. The car skidded slightly before stopping dead in the middle of the highway. My heart was pounding, ears ringing from the silence that followed. When I turned to face him, the passenger seat was empty. The door was still closed. The seatbelt lay unused. The faint smell of rain was already fading, replaced by the stale scent of my coffee. I sat there for several minutes, shaking, my hazard lights flashing in the empty Nevada desert. Not a single car passed by. Eventually, I forced myself to keep driving. Every few miles, I checked the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him sitting in the back seat. Nothing. Just the endless stretch of asphalt behind me. I made it to Ely around dawn. I checked into a cheap motel and barely slept. When I finally did, I dreamed of someone standing at the end of my bed, smiling faintly, whispering my name over and over in the same calm voice. I've driven Highway 50 several times since then, but never at night. I can't. I don't know who he was or what he wanted, but I still wake up sometimes, convinced I'll see him waiting by the roadside again, his hand raised, as though he's been expecting me all along. And the worst part is I know if I do, I'll stop again, because he already knows my name.